Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the lecture this evening, despite the bad weather and the dreadful traffic conditions. But you've come, of course, to hear another fabulous lecture. I apologise that I'm hosting the evening because Bill Tennant, current president, is on college business in Kuala Lumpur. We know what that means. But no, to be fair, I think he's gone there to get the whiskey and the haggises for the Burns night on Friday. So be charitable. Professor Mark Sims has come all the way from Leicester and is not a doctor of medicine. He's a physicist and he's Professor of Astrobiology and Space Instrumentation. And I gather, Vivian, your daughter is interested in astrobiology, is that correct?
Yes, that's something she did.
Right, so there we are.
Come and talk to me
Thank
afterwards.
you very much for coming, yes. So Mark has been in collaboration with Professor Tim Coates, who's the Professor of A&E Medicine in Leicester for about 8 years now, and he's going to tell us about his experiences and revolution in diagnosis. So thank you very much, Mark.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. As per the introduction, I'm not a clinician, so bear with me if I mispronounce some of the medical terms, etc. So I'm going to talk about the Diagnostics Development Unit, which is an attempt to achieve non-invasive diagnostics using state-of-the-art instrumentation. And it's a collaboration between myself, I come from the Space Research Centre in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, Paul Monks, who's an atmospheric chemist in chemistry, and Tim Coates, who is Professor of Emergency Medicine in the Emergency Medicine Group, who's both a member of the university and an A&E consultant, one of the few which are around, in Leicester Royal Infirmary. If anybody wants to follow more details of the DDU as it's become known, there is a website which is given down the bottom, and I'll give a series of contact names at the end. So, is that the right way? Yes. Okay. We've become sort of famous, or maybe infamous is the right word for it, in that when we gave a press event for the opening of the Diagnostics Development Unit, when we were about to screen our first patient back in 2011, and more of that later, we made the Daily Mail. I'm not sure whether that's fame or the opposite. We've also featured on the BBC One show this year and Inside Health on Radio 4. I think maybe at least one of those is still available, I think. So what we're trying to do is put together a whole suite of instrumentation. I'm not going to go through the instrumentation as it's labelled there because some of those are Daily Mail labels and they're not exactly accurate in some cases. But I'll come to the instrumentation a bit later. So what we're trying to do is translate Leicester research expertise in space and atmospheric science into medicine. As it occurred to us a long time ago, there are techniques out there that we use which potentially have got diagnostic power. Now, none of those techniques are new. A lot of these techniques have been used by other clinicians, but nobody's had the nerve or the stupidity, depending on which way you look at it, to try and actually put all this together in terms of a very big system, which we did. So, contents of this talk, I'm going to talk about the collaboration in the team members, how this came about. So how did a space scientist get involved in clinical diagnostics? Why we do this, what the clinical issues are, bear with me at that point, what the concept is, what its novel features are, what the equipment is and what the setup is and how we actually use that equipment, and then some of the possible clinical questions and the use of the equipment, and then a run through some of the initial results, and then the current status and summary. So what we're trying to do is develop the UK's perhaps first, we're not sure, non-invasive diagnostics development unit, and it's located in Leicester Royal Infirmary, which is about 20 minutes walk from the university. It's a cross-college project. University of Leicester is divided into colleges, so it's between the physical sciences and medicine. It's in collaboration with the University Hospital, with Leicester's NHS Trust, Space Research Centre, where I come from. We're part of physics and astronomy, chemistry, cardiovascular sciences, which has a cardiovascular biomedical research unit up at Glenfield Hospital, the Emergency Medicine Academic Group, which Tim Coates is a member of, IT services, which is become obvious why we need IT in a while, mathematics, again that will become obvious, and infection, immunity and inflammation, and potentially engineering, because ultimately we would like to engineer cheaper and smaller versions of the equipment we're actually using. And what we're trying to do is go back to the basics of medicine in terms of using the smell, the sight and the pulse to give a holistic picture of a patient's well-being and translate, as I said, chemistry and space science knowledge into the clinical environment. We'll come to the history of the DDU and how it came about in a second, but this all came about because we were very lucky to win a HEFGE Central Infrastructure grant back in 2008 for £500,000, which paid for the infrastructure and the equipment. So this is the academic team, very cross-disciplinary. We have Tim Coates, who's co-director, myself, who's co-director, Paul Monks in chemistry, Jeremy Leasley in mathematics, Alexander Gorban in mathematics. And why mathematics? Because you have this vast data set that ultimately you probably want to data mine in order to get characteristics of disease out of it. Derek Pullen is in the Space Research Centre. Ian White, who's just leaving us today in actual fact. Liam Gretton in IT services and Mike Baer in medicine. And Mike was the sort of man who said, well, it's a daft idea, but if you want to pursue it, go ahead and I'll back you. So thank Mike's support for this. Support the local trust, 3 PhD students at the moment, number of support nurses and staff, which are named there, and Health Protection England in terms of Tim Brooks, and I'll say how he fits in a second. And most importantly, from an equipment point of view, and use it in the hospital, a medical physics group, and Glenn Bush at the hospital's trust. So the background is how the hell did this come about? How did a physicist and a chemist get involved in this? Well, I was working until recently on a project looking for life on Mars, which, if you like, is one of my day jobs. DDU is a sort of a part-time job at the moment. And part of the problem there is you have to sterilise the apparatus that you send. There's actually a UN treaty which says you can't wantonly contaminate another planet with life or contaminate the Earth. And we hooked up with Health Protection Agency, and Tim Brooks in particular, in terms of looking for sterilisation techniques and assay techniques which wouldn't destroy our instrument, and an assay technique which said that essentially it would be clean. We also do work on multispectral imaging. I'll come back to what's meant by that a bit later, of planetary materials, looking at the geochemistry by looking at the spectral reflectance of materials under various light sources. We also had a project with the Forensic Science Service on imaging of forensic evidence using both multispectral and hyperspectral imaging. There's some examples of that to come. And at the same time, and I don't believe in coincidences, chemistry was developing mass spectrometry techniques to look at breath analysis. All this very nicely came together in about 2007, end of 2006, 2007, over several lunchtime conversations with Tim Brooks, who said, can we use state-of-the-art equipment to do what doctors did 100 years ago with the refinements in spectral analysis, mass spectrometry, etc.? We said, well, yeah, probably, and that resulted in a discussion with Mike Baer, then Paul Monks and Tim Coates, various unsuccessful funding bids, and then a success in 2008, September 2008, for this £500,000. And the DDU started in October 2008, and it took us to August 2011 to get it operational. It wasn't a quick process. What was the rationale for doing this? Well, the rationale is it's a government priority. Potentially it's a large market if you can come up with the right kind of widget. We believe that innovative technology which we had could assist and speed up treatment. So that was the rationale for doing it. So the aims are non-invasive detection of disease, correlate measurements with traditional diagnosis, derive disease symptoms, and then ultimately build bespoke point-of-care devices. And the nutshell summary is, can we build the Star Trek tricorder? A bit ambitious. I know there's a tricorder X Prize out there, but it is using sort of known technology. Or could we build a series of them for different medical needs? Well, after we sat down and thought about it, we thought, no, a bit too far-fetched at the moment, given what we know about disease states and potential physiological biomarkers, which is primarily where we work. So we'll start by building the sick bay bed. Can you build a bed which you can put a patient on, which you get information on, which aids diagnosis? So why non-invasive? Well, as you all know, invasive measurements and monitoring are unpleasant. There can be complications. You can have infection, radiation in some cases, false positives, false negatives. Non-invasive is back to basics. As somebody reminded us in a talk in Brighton last September, it's back to sort of Chinese medicine. It's the smell of disease, it's the look of disease, it's the feel of the pulse. And you can actually derive quite a lot from that information, particularly in an area like accident and emergency, where you need to make pretty rapid decisions. A laboratory test might take 4 or 5 hours to come back with a result. You want as much information as you can. And the whole diagnostics development unit is aimed at the moment at emergency medicine, acute care. It has other applications which I'll touch on later. So, smell of disease, as clinicians you're all aware of various disease states have particular smells, everything from liver disease through to diabetes to pneumonia, abscesses, gangrene, etc. They're all things which a doctor can actually smell. And as Tim Brooks said, he was an army doctor, he could walk down an army ward almost by smelling the patients, tell some of the disease states. Look of disease, various pallors, jaundice, faces, etc. And, the classic one, he looks like he's having a heart attack. He looks very sick. Now, doctors do that unconsciously. They're familiar with the look of disease. It's part of a subconscious correlation process that you all do to actually derive a disease state or the physiological state of a patient. And by feeling the pulse, you can look at changes in the way the heart is beating and the blood is flowing, back to Chinese diagnostics, as I said a few minutes ago. You can look at the rate, the rhythm, the strength, the variation, and derive something about the blood flow around the body. So the overall concept is to give additional and replacement information about a patient, not to replace invasive tests at the moment. And the question we're trying to ask ourselves, and we'll see some evidence that we're moving towards that, is there a particular physiological or metabolic biomarker for a disease that can be identified? And Tim's rationale is that physicians have lost some of the back to basic methods in some cases. Not all, obviously. And that's a gross, perhaps overstatement of the case. Technology gives you a new way of evaluating those parameters that doctors have used in the past and actually improving on them in some cases, as we'll see in a minute. And can you provide relevant information to assist in diagnosis and perhaps treatment in the future? And that includes rule in and rule out type information, probabilities. Is it sepsis? Is it not sepsis, etc.? Why sepsis, I'll come back to in a minute. So the novel features is we're trying to do this in real time. When we have a patient in for one of our studies, we spend 25 minutes measuring them, collecting the data. So it's not instant, but it's fairly quick. It's near patient. It brings equipment that you would never see into a clinical environment. We've got large volumes of subjects. 186,000, I think, come through accident emergency in Leicester a couple of years ago. So potentially there's a large volume of patients. Getting the ethics approval and getting them to consent is a different matter. I'll come back to that issue a bit later. You get a diversity of clinical conditions because it's in a hospital. It's an environment for industry. We've got some industrial studies going on. We've got a couple of companies who are doing TSB projects with us, that's Technology Strategy Board projects with us, where they bring their equipment in and see if it will actually work in a clinical environment. It's a bench-to-bedside approach, and it's pragmatic type methods. So where are we? What's the long-term vision? Well, we started in acute care. We want to go to routine screening in hospitals. We started thinking about, could we build this equipment small enough that we could put it into the next generation ambulance? And despite what Tim says, I still think there's actually a case for real-time data en route to the hospital. Tim's attitude in a very busy accident and emergencies, he just wants to know whether the patient's coming in 5 minutes, 10 minutes or 20 minutes. But ultimately, particularly with some of the computing technologies which are coming along, maybe you can actually put some of this equipment in the next generation ambulance. I'll come back to that later. Perhaps GP surgeries, maybe ultimately in high street in chemists, home diagnosis, perhaps. And perhaps something which is more short to medium term is emergency services in military infield diagnostics. And we've made some contacts with the military medicine people in Birmingham. When we started this back in 2008, at the beginning of 2009, we had a sand pit where we locked, and amazingly managed to get 24 clinicians at one time into a room and described to them what the equipment could do and said, what are the things you think it might be able to do, what it can do. So these were some of the things that came up. Can spectral analysis of facial photography determine renal dysfunction? We're about to find that out. The study we're about to do. Can breath analysis identify the severity of DKA, etc., etc. I'll leave you to read those. And when we actually compiled this group of clinicians who had not heard about the equipment before came up with 42 different disease states, disease subconditions, which they could potentially see for this equipment. So we knew we weren't completely wasting our time. So what do we got in terms of equipment? Well, we want to look at the smell of a patient. The smell of a patient is predominantly volatile organic carbon compounds, okay? Well, VOCs. So we've got a mass spectrometer where we can do sweat and body odor analysis. We can do urine analysis in terms of the head space of urine. We can do VOCs from swab samples. And we can do VOCs with electronic nose. And the electronic nose may be the technology for miniaturizing this mass spectrometer. You'll see the size of it in a minute. It's not small. We want to look at the colour and the pallor of the patient. And so we've got facial and skin colour throughout the spectrum. We've got a hyperspectral camera. I'll talk about what that is in a minute. It covers a large wavelength range at very narrow spectral resolution. We've got a multispectral camera. We've got some small point-and-shoot spectrometers in the infrared. I'll talk about these in a bit. We've got a context digital camera. You can actually do quite a bit, we found out, with the basic digital camera by looking at the pallor of the patient. And we want to contrast that with the thermal profile of the patient. And for that, we use an infrared imager. That's, if you like, those three are the imaging side. And then we get into the cardiovascular monitoring. And there is actually a link here back to the Apollo space program and the Mercury and Gemini space programs. There's a direct link back to space technology here in thoracic electrical bioimpedance, which was developed by NASA in the 1960s, to look at the blood flow around the thorax in astronauts. Now, it was tried in medicine, And the doctor said, yeah, it works, didn't give us an exact result. So it's not as good as our sort of gold standard type techniques where you perhaps push something, do an invasive measurement. But so it was abandoned from the clinical point of view. But in an acute care situation, in an emergency care situation, you're not necessarily after the gold standard. You're after information which you can use to diagnose or rule in or rule out various conditions. So we've got a thoracic electrical bioimpedance system which looks at blood flow through the thorax. We can do transcutaneous oximetry. We can do cardiac output with a suprasternal Doppler. And we've got conventional non-invasive parameters, all the ones you're familiar with a ProPac monitoring system. For infrared skin characteristics, wide infrared, I'll come back to that in a bit. So this is what he looks like. He doesn't look like this to the patient, okay? So what we've got is we've got a suite of cameras on a trolley with their own computer system and their own monitors. We've got a rack of cardiovascular monitors, which are all computer linked. So we can actually dump the data directly from the monitors onto a computer system. We have this massive mass spectrometer at the back, which is a time of flight mass spectrometer. We have a capnometer here for NO, and we have CO2 measurement as well. We have a gas sampling system which has been developed over the years by Paul Monks. So a whole suite of instruments. Now how this fits in reality, I'll show you in a minute. In actual fact, on this slide, so things like the mass spectrometer are hidden away from the patient. So what we have is we have patients in two areas. This area here is normally curtained off at this point, and we can actually put a patient in there on a bed and measure them. And we can actually, not at great expense, through an X-ray wall here, a series of tubes which are all angled so X-rays don't penetrate, so that we can actually measure patients in one of the resuscitation bays. So we can measure potentially very sick patients. We do have an issue with getting very sick patients to consent, but I'll come back to that. And the idea is to use A&E patients to produce a database. There's lots of data out there, and part of the issue in doing this sort of thing is, what does a normal person look like? What's a normal variation you get in people which aren't ill? We use minor injury patients for that, people with bruises, etc. And we do like to do some spectral work on those, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then for each of the conditions in accident and emergency, are there characteristic signatures you're seeing? So we've decided to start with limited clinical studies. And as I say, we had 42 different diseases we could look at. And we thought what we'd do is we'd look at the top 20 presenting complaints in accident and emergency at Leicester. I'll list some of those later. And that's to give us a database so we can then figure out what future studies we want to do. And the studies we want to do is sepsis. I'll come back to that in a minute. We maintain an archive of all the data, and some of the equipment, the imaging equipment in particular and the cardiovascular equipment, we can relocate for particular studies. We're about to do a study on the colour of kidney patients. We all know they've got this peculiar colour, but we're going to look at the correlation with the renal function. Is there a point at which you start to see marked colour changes, and can you actually use that for diagnosis? And that's actually done at the General Hospital in Leicester. The imaging equipment will be moved there, hopefully this week or next week, to actually start that study. And this is a setup. We have all the equipment, which is linked to computers, each individual computer, one for imaging, one for breath analysis or gas analysis, because we can do headspace analysis. I'll come back to some headspace analysis results in a minute. And the medical devices, or the cardiovascular ones, each with their own data archive and all linked to a central computer and an archive and actually linked to the university system. The way that we do this is, as members of the university, we have no idea who the patients are. They're anonymous as far as we're concerned. They're just a number. only the people working in the NHS, the nurses and Tim Coates, can actually do the correlation in terms of identification of a person, and that's one of the ways we have ethics approval. And what we're doing is we're running, it's a bit like a space mission really, which is one of the other factors which came into this, is you want a sort of fixed procedure, you want a protocol, you want to, what we do in a mission operations, you'd have a series of measurement protocols, or in this case sampling protocols, you select the script, you synchronize the timelines, you assign the patient data folders, you acquire the data, you reacquire it if it's not right, you then do a quality assurance protocol on it, and you load the database. That goes into the system down the hospital. We then put that onto a multiply backed up system at the university, anonymously in terms of the patients, so we can actually analyse the data. And in order to do that, we've come up with this quite complicated scheme in terms of labelling the files. Because what we haven't done yet is put this into a database. What we've done is just get a great collection of data where we can actually put an ID on each file which tells us what it was, what the patient was, what the session was. So we can actually then do data processing. And that's a bit more of the detail, which I won't bore you with. It's up to say you have files associated with images, files associated with cardiovascular data, etc. So I'm going to take you through the various techniques now, starting with how I came into this from the hyperspectral and multispectral imaging point of view, and what can it do from a medical point of view. Well, the principle is quite simple. You image a target in a number of discrete bands over a given wavelength band, and you can do hyperspectral and multispectral imaging. UV, visible, near infrared, shortwave infrared, long-wave infrared, or even up to terahertz frequencies, which is some interesting absorption features there. So you have a known source, either a natural source or an artificial broadband source or a narrowband source, and you're looking at the reflectance of that surface with that known light source. And the characteristics of the targets can change that reflected light. As you can, in some cases, get unique signatures of objects, chemicals, features, absorbance, etc., may be visible. Not always, but may be visible. And the two types that you can do hyperspectral, where you get continuous coverage, high resolution, 2 to 5 nanometers over quite a wide band, or you can have multispectral, where you have a number of discrete bands which are not necessarily continuous coverage, but might have quite wide widths. And I'll come back to that in a second. In some cases, you can enhance the effect by having a wavelength tunable light source, which is one thing we do have. So what can you use it for medicine for? This is very early data. We use both visible and near infrared in the DDU. We have a scanning mirror system for the hyperspectral, which means that the patient has to stay still for a couple of seconds. And this is actually an early result with a multispectral imaging system, which wasn't, but a continuous multispectral imaging system. Come back to it in a minute. And at certain wavelengths, you can actually see quite deep into the body. If you image in the 600 to 900 nanometer region, you can actually see quite deep structures in a hand, for example. And in neonates, if you have a bright enough light source, you can actually see all the way through them. So you can either use backlighting or front lighting. And hyperspectral imaging in medical use isn't new. It's already been used extensively in skin cancer studies and in wound healing. Now, why does it work? Well, this is an absorption plot versus wavelength of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin, and you see various absorption features which differ between the two types of blood. So this is a multispectral imaging of my PA who left a few years ago, and this is a map of his blood signature, which is this W-type shape, and the shape there is dependent on the oxygenation of the blood in the top millimetre, less than a millimetre of the skin. So by actually taking a picture in spectral wavelengths, you can actually derive a rough value for oxygenation. The other thing I came into this project with was thermal infrared imaging, where you can look at the temperature distribution across the body, looking for temperature difference and abnormalities. It's been used clinically in the past, variety of different things, breast cancer, inflammation, etc. But nowadays, cameras have come on no end in their technology, infrared cameras. And you can get quite high resolutions, 640 by 480. You can actually even get a 2048 by 2048 now, and very sensitive temperature changes. We actually use a FLIR T60 uncooled microbolometer array in the DDU. And it's so sensitive that if I put my hand on a wall and take it away and point an infrared camera at that, I can tell that I've touched that wall. You can actually see handprints across a wall even if you only touch it for a fraction of a second. The sort of work you can do from a medical point of view is you can look at the core and peripheral temperatures in the body, measure potentially a shutdown. In the DDU, we image in the infrared all face and arms, and I'll come back to some results in a minute. And we've got a small study on patients with fever and sepsis, which we're still continuing. And we've got some ideas for some further studies in the future. So this was a student project looking at fever, sepsis in normals. It's finished now. We're just in the process of writing some of these results up. And this is clear. You can see in the infrared, which is a map of temperature, clear physical changes. So that's normal. That's fever. And there's a spotty pattern, something you see in children but you don't see in adults. But you actually starts to reappear in adults in severe fever. You can't see it visually, but you can see it in the temperatures. And this is a patient tending towards sepsis, they're developing sepsis. And you get a characteristic difference in terms of the shape. Now, how you actually classify that is proved to be very difficult. Human eye is very good at pointing out patterns. Doing it mathematically has proved a lot more difficult than we hoped. But the thing that we have found is you need to model and image the body based on its thermal physiology rather than its anatomy. A lot of the clinical studies to date using thermal infrared imaging have been based on anatomy. And you have to look where the heat is generated in the body and how it's dissipated. So it's more sort of like a physics type approach to heat within the body. And we think we've got a new conceptual model for body temperature changes in fever and sepsis, but we need to verify that with additional data. And there's the actual diagnosis for clinicians. And you can do quite fancy things. You can draw lines across and measure the things. These are actually reference markers, so we know where we are as we scale things to a standard arm in the end. And in terms of cardiovascular, you can look at things like systemic vascular resistance. So some data from Tim. This is controls. This is ED arrival. And that's after processing ED. And we can do the breath and headspace gas analysis of volatile organic compounds. And here's some results. This is bacteria. So we've got a culture of bacteria in a plate rather than from the body, though we can do this theoretically in the body. Different strains. And if you do a principal components analysis, you can actually pick out the different strains by their pattern of gases they emit in AMUs from 0 to 400. So these are different MZ values, and you can actually do that. Similarly, you've kids with cystic fibrosis, with and without respiratory infection. Again, you get a characteristic change in what they're breathing out, and that was published in Breath Research in 2011. This is air. This is cystic fibrosis with infection, which are the red ones, without infection, yellow ones in controls, and you see a characteristic change. Okay, it's not foolproof, but it does give you a pointer. And this is quite exciting results which have only recently come out by, as Paul Monks would say, by smelling poo, we can tell what ribotype of C. difficile is potentially present. And this is a study not with actual poo itself, but with C. difficile in dishes, take them from real samples, and you can actually again see that you can actually lump some of these things together quite well. There's obviously some overlap in some cases. And to show the sensitivity of this, we can do real-time monitoring of breath. Here is acetone on the breath of this chap here. Give him some chewing gum, and you start to see methanol coming into the breath and then decaying away. And we've actually done a study where we've taken students and paid them to get drunk, which they love, and then watched their ethanol metabolism work. And we can tell by measuring the breath how long it's been since somebody had a drink, which is quite useful from a police point of view as well as a treatment point of view. And the breath analysis, you get data like this. This is a plot of seconds. This is mass charge ratio. And so if you take a single mass charge ratio, you can see how it changes as a function of time. If you take a cut through here at any point, you can see what the volatile organic carbon compounds are. So where are we going with this? We started with lots of equipment and no people. We managed to rustle up some funds for the research nurses, and a lot of our research to date has been done by the PhD students, which are all in the final stages of finishing and writing up. And we've got a database of data, which I'll come to in a minute. So we're looking at things like going to EPSERC for data analysis and data mining with our mathematician friends, sepsis. We might measure stroke volume response to fluid bolus in leg raise, fractured neck of femur. Some of these are quite small studies. Maybe you only need 20 or 30 patients. That's one of the issues with some of these technologies in the past when people have used breath analysis. They've measured 5 patients and come to conclusions. Okay, it might be true. There might be characteristic biomarkers for some of these conditions, but there might not, depending on what the normal variation is. We've got a student at the moment looking at the variation during the day. What does your breath look like if you clean your teeth? What does your breath look like if you've eaten within an hour, etc.? And currently we're doing what was going to be a 550 patient study of the top 20 presenting complaints, which 105 were controls, minor injury, and that was chest pain, abdominal pain, breathlessness, fever. You can read them for yourselves. And we've so far done 142 as of December 2013. There are issues with consent and our productivity, which I'll come to in a minute. We've transferred that data into the file structure for later incorporation in a database. Got some of the initial data analysis underway. That's in terms of per measurement, breath analysis, cardiovascular imaging, etc. What we hope to do is meld this data together. Is there a combination of image data, cardiovascular data, breath analysis data for particular, so you come up with a physiological profile or a metabolic, metabolomics, as Paul would say, or a metabolic profile or biomarkers for particular cases. We've done an initial sepsis study. We're going to extend that as a result of the results. Got an ethics application which hopefully was signed off today for hyperspectral imaging studies of kidney patients, liver patients, skin lesions and bruising. There's an overview paper on the DDU submitted to the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine, which went back in this week following referees' comments, and we've got various funding applications underway. So what are the issues? We had a very, very low recruitment rate when we started. We had perhaps one a month if we were really lucky. And so we got round that by having a technician to run the equipment to replace the PhD students who were running the equipment at the time. We made the equipment room as well as the resuscitation bay available for patients because we found that the resuscitation bays at Leicester Royal Infirmary were always full of very ill patients who didn't want to consent. We've got practitioner nurses for the minor injury controls. We've started collecting a minimal data set. So if a piece of equipment doesn't work, we still carry on. It means you have sort of holes in your data perhaps, but it's better than nothing. And we did a lot of role playing for consent because we found out that actually approaching the patient in the right way made consent easier. You have sick patients who are competent but unable to consent. So we'll look at it in an abbreviated consent process. And in the breath analysis case, we do two things. We have a single breath, a single deep breath, and we do multiple breath studies. And some of the very sick patients were unable to do the single breath samples. We tried selling this as a big idea to MRC and various other people. You know, this is a way that we can contribute to medicine. Nobody's bought into that, probably because we didn't have results at the time. And so we've undertaken a series of projects with particular conditions. So in summary, what we try to do is put together, we're not sure it's the first, non-invasive diagnostics development unit located at Leicester Royal Infirmary. Equipment's integrated in running and is collecting data and is looking at clinical applications, including some with industry. We've managed to somehow blend the expertise from a number of different departments into a system that works. Everything, as I say, from space science through to cardiovascular sciences, through to mathematics. And collaborations with other teams and other clinicians are welcome. Biggest problem we have is getting clinicians involved in this, because they're obviously extremely busy. And we hope later this year to recruit a second clinician alongside Tim Coates to work on the diagnostics development unit. So that's the contact details. There is a website where you find more details about the DDU. It's about to be updated. Tim and I are the co-directors. We're always happy to talk to people about ideas, crazy or not. Paul Monks has been the guy who ran our budget and looked after the equipment coordination. And we have monthly meetings, which people are welcome to attend or come to if you have an idea on how to use it. So acknowledgements, University of Leicester, which let me spend my private research time doing this. University Hospitals Leicester Trust, who enabled us to put the DDU in the first place. And we've only survived because of interest from the equipment manufacturers. They see a future market in this. So we have equipment which has gone out of warranty, and the equipment manufacturer said, well, don't worry about it, we'll give you a new one, which is great. So we've had from Fleur, where we got thermal imager, Gildan Photonics, where we got the hyperspectral imager, Ocean Thin Films, where we got the SpectraCam, which is this narrowband spectral imager, and Core Technology, who made the mass spectrometer for us. Clinical Local Research Network, which kindly put us on their portfolio so we could get some nurses, and the DDU team. So thank you very much for listening. I will try to answer any questions, but don't make them too clinical, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. It was very, very stimulating. I'm particularly interested in the electronic nose. This is a bit flippant, because my wife's birthday's coming up. I'm just wondering if it might be something she could use. It's presumably a massive bit of kit, is it?
Yeah, no, it's very small in actual fact. It's probably this sort of size. And the way it works is you've got a series of polymers on a micro cantilever. So it's a tiny little cantilever, which essentially is weighed down, so it bends basically. And as molecules are absorbed onto the surface, it bends more. So you measure the bending of the cantilevers. You have a series of different compounds across the different cantilevers. And so you get a characteristic pattern depending on what gas you put into the system. Now, what it doesn't do is it doesn't do what the mass spectrometer does. So as you've got lots of MZ49, it's a pattern matching thing. But what it is it's portable and small, and potentially the way you take this massive mass spectrometer. I should say the mass spectrometer, all this equipment is state-of-the-art. It was state-of-the-art when we bought it. The mass spectrometer will measure to parts per trillion in terms of sensitivity.
It's fantastic, isn't it? So it would fit in my wife's handbag then, really.
The electronic nose, it would have to be a big handbag, but yes, it would. Rucksack at the moment.
Questions?
All stunned.
All these diagnosticians here. Julie first.
Hi, I'm Denise. I'm going to be able to work my
It's a good question.
We'd love that.
Yeah, I know you'd love that. I mean, every clinician we talk to says, "Oh, I'd love one of these. I could do this with it." And we've teamed up with a vascular surgeon who's got lots of ideas. Well, I want one of these, or I want one of those. The problem with miniaturising the technology isn't the issue. We can see ways of miniaturising the technology. You can now actually get mass spectrometers on a silicon chip, for example, or you can use electronic nose technique, or you can build very small thermal imagers for waving over a patient. See, and a vascular surgeon has the idea of using thermal imaging to see when blood is flowing back into a region which he's operating on, or the hyperspectral imaging to see when blood's flowing back into a region which he's operated on. And in cases of amputation, have you done it right? The thing is, what are you looking for? What is the measurement which tells you the result you want? Okay? And in some cases, it's very obvious, like blood flow and stuff like that. In others, it won't be. And so we started off in sort of 2008, sort of being pretty naive, thinking, oh, we'll do a few measurements and we'll throw out a few devices and we'll make a fortune, or the university will make a fortune, as they own all our IP, but never mind. And, we can get this into the clinical environment very, very quickly. We then started to discover that all sorts of factors come into play. You have to, for the imaging, you have to have particular light sources. You have to have stable light sources. So there are techniques to get around instability. You can't do it in normal fluorescent light or operating lights and stuff like that. The thermal infrared imager, if you need almost a stand to put it on, now maybe you can have some of these fancy sort of weighted stands which you can wave around over your patient. What you need to do is you need to understand what you're looking for, what the marker is of a particular case. Now, in some cases, it will be very simple. In other cases, it will be quite complicated. For example, if you look at the VOCs for cystic fibrosis, there's a pattern there. The problem with a lot of this non-invasive technology which has been used to date, people have said, oh, it must be X, single parameter. Now, in our experience, it's never a single parameter. It's a combination of parameters. It's building up enough knowledge to make it a sensible decision. Now, in some cases, if you want a simple device just to look for blood flow, yes, we can do that now. We know ways of miniaturising that technology. It's not particularly cheap at the moment, but you could do it. Sorry, a bit of a comprehensive answer, but...
She's writing it. She's taking your ideas, look. This is how it happens.
Sorry, the university owns my IP,
Stealing
not you.
Yes, sorry. Liz.
You mentioned neonates. I mean, they're a particular group where, you're trying to be as least invasive as possible.
Yep.
Paediatrics in general, infants particularly, and I don't know if you have any links with the neonatal team in Leicester.
We do. We're just about... We have a student project which is looking at neonates. It was going to look at breath analysis of neonates. But the ethics approval has been a nightmare in this process. You're all probably familiar with this. It was a new process as far as I was concerned, getting ethics approval for things. It's taken 11 months and we still haven't got approval for this student study, and the student has to write up in 2 months' time. So one of the issues here is actually not taking the data, it's being able to take the data in the first place, particularly if it's a project which isn't on the local portfolio, which a lot of these aren't. Yes, we'd like to look at neonates. Yes, we can do things like image neonates with the spectral cameras, the thermal camera. But what has repeatedly held us up has been the ethics approval. We became operational in 2011, and the ethics people are doing their job, and I have no argument with that. But it took us until June 2012 for them to finally tick every box so we could actually measure our first patient rather than volunteers. And so, we'd love to do neonates, and we can think of great things to do with neonates. And hopefully that will come now. Now we've got to get the box ticked.
That's good, yes. It is a nuisance, isn't it, ethics?
It's there for a reason, of course, but...
Oh, yes. Essential, I think. Any more questions? Yes, Vivian, yes.
I'm a microbiologist, so I'm particularly interested in the sepsis data you said is collected. What were you looking at? You showed us the pictures.
Yeah, the sepsis data, there's been a study by Tim Coates and a colleague who was at Leicester looking at deep tissue oxygenation and systemic vascular resistance. And Tim and Chris were the two people which did the study, found a correlation between survival and measurements of deep tissue oxygenation. And you can think you've recovered a patient in accident emergency and you send them home and sadly they die. And there's actually a correlation. So if you actually measure some of these parameters, we hope to extend that with the thermal infrared imaging, you may be able to characterize the depth of sepsis or the probability of survival or the fact that you haven't actually done enough treatment yet to release the patient. And that's one of our great future projects, is doing sepsis. We're going to start we've got the ethics approval for this one, I should say, to actually start imaging very ill patients with sepsis in ICU. And that project will start very, very shortly, and we'll see if there's any characteristic thermal patterns. You can actually do some quite clever things. We've got some software where if we take an infrared image of the face, we can measure the essentially the core temperature of the body by looking in the corner of the eye, and the peripheral temperature by looking at the coldest point of the nose. Now, does that correlate with the level of sepsis? Does it correlate with different disease states? Does the colour of the patient tell you something? By just doing red, green, blue ratios in visible images, does that correlate with a given disease state, look of a heart attack, sepsis, etc.? We think the power is in combining the techniques. Now that is a little way off, because when you actually look at this data, you've got radically different data. You've got imaging data, you've got colour data, you've got cardiovascular data, potentially you've got breath analysis data. So you end up with this sort of disparate data set, which somehow you have to combine together to get result out of it. And that's where our mathematical friends come in, especially Alexander Gorban, who's a Russian mathematician. He's done a lot of work in putting disparate data sets together. He comes up with techniques where you get a sort of multi-dimensional shape, and that shape tells you something about the condition or the study you're doing. Tim Coates and Alex have done a study on accident emergency patients from a national database. Not to give too much away, there was actually a sort of tail on this shape, and those are the poor people which don't actually survive.
Any more questions? Sorry, Adrian.
Do you have problems with racial differences?
It's one thing we're about to investigate. Not so much in terms of cardiovascular or breath analysis. Though we're still looking at race as one of the parameters, okay? But in terms of perhaps some of the imaging stuff, in that we all have a series of pigments within our skin, and the amount of pigment defines how well you can see changes. Now, one of the things we're going to do, hopefully next week, is start looking at kidney patients. And there we've got a series of mixed different ethnicities to actually see whether there is can we see a measurable difference, and can we then correlate that with kidney function? And that's a 20 patient study, 30 patient study, which some will be acute kidney patients on dialysis, some will be with just mild kidney disease. And is there a sort of threshold beyond which you start to see colour or spectral changes? Now, you, as doctors, you know it in terms of liver disease and jaundice. People with bad liver disease, you can see the colour change. But is there a point at which you can start to see that colour change before it becomes acute liver disease? And that might vary with race, it might vary with whether the person's wearing makeup, whether they've got artificial tan on, okay? All these parameters we're starting to investigate. And my research student is just finishing off his PhD, is doing a study at the moment in can you measure blood oxygenation with people with artificial tan? Because it changes the spectral reflectance of their face with a given light source. So when you start to get into this, you find all sorts of parameters start to come along. And Paul Thomas at Loughborough is also into breath analysis, and he's come up with the term, well, everything seems to make it vary. So are we wasting our time? And the answer is probably not, because there are characteristic patterns in infection and stuff like that.
Peter, did you just make this the last question?
Slightly silly question, but I must say that as author of a textbook on physical signs, I have to say I'm somewhat disappointed to see the art of medicine being overtaken by such wonderful science. And thank you very much for showing it to us. As a physician, I was always interested in the smell of patients.
Yeah.
And there's been a certain amount of work recently on dogs smelling urine of patients with kidney and bladder tumours.
Yep.
Can you say anything about that?
We haven't done anything on that, but we've looked at, I think what cancer we've looked at, meatrial cancer with swabs, and we can actually see characteristic volatile organic carbon patterns with that. Dogs have sort of got an inbuilt processing system. Where we struggle is with the breath analysis system, we've got potentially up to 400 different compounds if you put one at every mass charge ratio in variations from parts per thousand to parts per trillion in some pattern. And yes, animals do that, and they do very good at that, but they've been trained on sort of test specimens, if you like. We have a series of cancer studies we could do with the smell. We've done one, as I say, at the moment. We've got several others that we're planning, including bladder cancer and stuff like that. To be frank, we were rather overwhelmed when we did this sandpit, and we had this 42 different sort of disease states and sub-disease states and stuff like that, and I've still got a big spreadsheet with them all on. And so we decided we'd pick something to start with. And the thing we decided to pick was, what does a normal population look like? What's the variation in a normal population? And so we undertook this, what we called the 400 patient study, the 20 patients or the top 20 presenting complaints, to see if there's patterns in those. Because Tim Coates' motivation is, can I come up with a method which enables me to rule in or rule out things quicker without having to wait for an invasive test? For example, paracetamol testing takes 3 or 4 hours to get back. This technique, none of these techniques are particularly relevant for that, but that's an example of the time duration you've got. So we said, well, we'll start with accident emergency patients, and then we'll do other studies. We've done some swab studies on cancer, as I say, and there are characteristic patterns. Those are swabs taken from patients. Because you can do the analysis not on the patient, but you do it on a swab or a sample from the patient, whether it's urine, blood, feces, etc., and do it that way. And we've looked at, can you do a sort of a clever system which looks at the urine and the feces from a patient and does a diagnosis on how they smell, basically.
There we are. So no dogs on the wards yet, Peter. Thank you very much, Mark. And for the
Pleasure.
last, Lizzie Didcock, who's a paediatrician, as you discovered earlier, just to give a vote of thanks.
Yes, Professor Sims, thank you for a super talk. I think I was particularly struck by what a great example it is of the different disciplines coming together. So space research, organic chemistry, spectral imaging you talked about, and the sick bay from Star Trek, which is a particular good example of mine. And a reminder, as Dr. Tolkien was saying, of the importance of the basics of medicine, using one's senses. So certainly sight and smell. Thinking about some of the more unsavoury patients I have, I'm glad in some ways not taste wasn't suggested, because that could be unpleasant, although cystic fibrosis is a good example where taste was very key. So thank you very much indeed for a super talk.
Pleasure.